Hey everyone, this is Noah Zerby. In this video series, we look at the United Nations system. In other videos, we look at the historical origins, structure, functions, and contemporary issues facing the United Nations. This video focuses in particular on peacekeeping operations, so let's get started. The blue helmets or blue berets of peacekeeping forces are probably the most iconic image of the United Nations. Interestingly, the use of peacekeeping forces is not specifically mentioned anywhere in the UN Charter. Rather, the Security Council's role in addressing threats to international peace and security are outlined in two provisions, Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Chapter 6 provides for the peaceful settlement of disputes through Security Council intervention in the form of negotiation, mediation, arbitration, or judicial decisions. Under Chapter 6, the Council may investigate disputes or may make recommendations to parties regarding specific settlements. Chapter 7 is broader in its mandate. Under Chapter 7, the Security Council may decide what measures shall be taken to maintain or restore international peace and security. Chapter 7 permits the Security Council to authorize sanctions against countries found to have disrupted the peace or to authorize the use of force against them. Because of this, peacekeeping operations are sometimes referred to as Chapter 6.5, falling somewhere in between the peaceful settlement of disputes under Chapter 6 and the use of force for collective security under Chapter 7. The deployment of peacekeeping forces is normally authorized by the Security Council in response to a request by a member state. During the Cold War, the standoff between the US and the Soviet Union limited the deployment of forces to regional conflicts between relatively small states. Peacekeeping forces would be deployed to monitor ceasefires, literally placing themselves between the opposing sides. They had limited or light armaments and did not present a combat threat to either side. Rules of engagements were developed in cooperation and were subject to the approval of the host governments. The end of the Cold War changed the nature of peacekeeping operations. The traditional mission of monitoring the peace evolved into broader missions of peace building and peace enforcement. At the same time, the complexity and size of operations increased. The first peacekeeping operation was deployed in 1948 to monitor the ceasefire between the then newly created State of Israel and its Arab neighbors. That mission, the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization, or UNTSO, continues to operate even today. Since then, there have been 62 other UN peacekeeping missions. Of those, 14 are currently still underway. As you can see from this map, the vast majority of peacekeeping missions have historically been and continue to be in Africa. The United Nations currently has 14 peacekeeping missions underway. These are operations in Haiti, where the UN forces are working with the government to help develop national policing capacity, strengthen justice and prison systems, and improve the protection of human rights. Cyprus, where since 1964 UN forces have maintained a buffer zone and de facto ceasefire between Greek and Turkish Cypriots. Kosovo, where the original mission to disarm groups and protect human rights has expanded to a focus on facilitating an inclusive society for all ethnic groups in the country. Kashmir, where since 1949 the United Nations has maintained observer forces along the India-Pakistani border to report ceasefire violations. Golan, where since 1973 UN forces have monitored Israeli and Syrian separation. Lebanon, established in 1978, the UN Interim Force in Lebanon originally monitored Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, but since 1973 it's continued to provide protection and assistance to the local population. The UN Truce Supervision Organization was the first UN peacekeeping operation authorized in 1948 and has been in continued existence since then. Its operations include a number of countries in the Middle East, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and it supervises armistice agreements, monitors ceasefires, and prevents escalation between parties. The UNTSO also serves as a ready deployment force capable of providing supplemental peacekeeping forces in other operations should the need arise. The UN mission in Western Sahara was established in 1991 in order to oversee the ceasefire and, in theory, a referendum on the future of Western Sahara, which continues to be claimed by both Morocco, which controls about 3/4 of the country, and a Mauritanian-supported government which claims the remaining 1/3. The UN maintains two separate peacekeeping operations in South Sudan. The first is located in the Abyei region of the border of South Sudan and Sudan. This operation was established to monitor and support the delivery of humanitarian aid and is authorized to use force to protect humanitarian workers and civilians in the area. The second is the UN mission in South Sudan, which was established to support the government of South Sudan, protect civilians, monitor and investigate human rights violations, support humanitarian assistance, and to promote the implementation of peace agreements between South Sudan and its northern neighbor. The UN peacekeeping mission in Darfur in Sudan is intended to address local conflicts, protect civilians, and support delivery of humanitarian assistance in the region. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, UN peacekeepers are charged with protection of civilians, protection of human rights, disarmament, facilitation of humanitarian access, and demobilization and reintegration of former combatants into society. The UN peacekeeping mission in Mali was authorized in 2013 in order to monitor the implementation of the ceasefire, facilitate political reconciliation, and assist in the reintegration of displaced persons, as well as to deliver humanitarian assistance and protect human rights. And finally, the UN mission in the Central African Republic was deployed in 2014 in order to protect civilians, prevent violence, and support the fragile infrastructure in the Central African Republic. We can think about UN peacekeeping operations as being divided into broad phases or generations. First-generation peacekeeping operations were most common during the Cold War period. Examples here might include current operations in Lebanon or the UNDOF. In first-generation peacekeeping operations, UN peacekeepers are neutral third-party observers and were literally placed between combating parties in order to monitor ceasefires that had already been agreed to. The consent of all combatant parties was necessary before peacekeeping operations would be deployed. The peacekeepers themselves were viewed as neutral and impartial observers and were empowered only to use force as a last resort and in self-defense. The goals of such operations were to monitor agreements and to provide transparency for parties to the conflict, thus building trust over time. The end of the Cold War marked an important period of transition in UN peacekeeping operations. The traditional limits on the use of peacekeeping forces gave way, and the United Nations found itself operating in more complex, multi-dimensional peacekeeping operations that blurred the lines of police, civilian, and military operations. Some observers defined this second generation of peacekeeping operations as peace building. While the United Nations still only operated with the consent of the national governments involved, during the second generation of operations, the UN increasingly focused on expanding the capacity of national governments through assistance with economic reconstruction, institutional transformation, for example, of police, military courts, and judicial systems, or the development of civil society. Examples of this work included UN operations in Namibia, El Salvador, Cambodia, and Mozambique. This generation of peacekeeping was sometimes referred to as peace building because the emphasis was not just on maintaining a ceasefire that already existed, but on the construction of the political and economic conditions necessary for the maintenance of a lasting peace. The third generation of peacekeeping operations expanded the role of the UN still further. Unlike second-generation operations, which continued to require the consent of all parties involved, third-generation peacekeeping operations shifted the role of UN peacekeepers to active combatants. They were empowered to take sides in a conflict and, in order to protect human rights and civilians, to ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid, or even to disarm combatants, they were empowered to use force. They were no longer neutral third-party observers, but could now be active participants in the conflict. Because of this broader mandate, third-generation operations were frequently referred to as peace enforcement. Most often, this took place at the domestic level in response to civil wars emerging within states. Examples of third-generation operations might include the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, or Somalia. Finally, fourth-generation peacekeeping operations partner with regional organizations like the European Union, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or the African Union in pursuit of peace. Examples here might include operations in Bosnia, where the UN worked with NATO, or more currently in Darfur and Mali, where the African Union is an active participant in peacekeeping operations. As of June 2018, there are approximately 120,000 peacekeepers deployed around the world. About 91,000 of these are uniformed soldiers donated from 123 different countries, with the remainder being support personnel. The total operational budgets of these operations come to about $7.9 billion. But where do these soldiers come from and how are they financed? Peacekeeping forces themselves are provided by member states on a voluntary basis. Importantly, peacekeeping soldiers remain members of their respective national armed forces. They do not constitute a United Nations standing army. Indeed, one of the central problems faced by the United Nations is that it lacks a rapid response team capable of quickly intervening to address crises. This is because the UN must solicit personnel from member states for each operation. Why do countries contribute soldiers to peacekeeping operations? There are a couple of answers. Countries in the developing world often contribute large number of peacekeeping soldiers. The reason for this is simple. The United Nations provides a stipend payable to the home country to compensate for the deployment of soldiers to UN peacekeeping operations. The amount, about $1,000 per soldier per month plus about $70 for equipment, provides a steady source of funding for militaries in countries like Ethiopia or Rwanda, where the pay is low and equipment is limited. India, for example, pays its soldiers about $360 per month, far less than the stipend it receives from the United Nations. But for countries like the United States, the cost of basic training for a soldier can exceed $50,000. That's not to say that all donations to UN peacekeeping operations are motivated purely by economics. Supporting UN peacekeeping operations can be a source of domestic and international prestige, particularly for smaller countries like Fiji or Nepal. Countries may also contribute peacekeeping soldiers because they support multilateral efforts at collective security. For middle powers like Belgium, Canada, and Norway, this is the case, and their soldiers often form the core command structure for UN operations. Finally, for some countries like India, Japan, and Germany, support for UN operations may be made in hopes of securing a seat on the Security Council. This is not a quid pro quo arrangement. Nevertheless, these countries may view support for UN peacekeeping operations as another justification in support of their desire for a permanent seat on the Council. By contrast, some countries like the United States have long resisted placing their soldiers under UN jurisdiction. As a result, the US and many other developed countries have contributed relatively few peacekeeping soldiers. Funding for peacekeeping operations comes through an assessment imposed on member states, though member states may make additional donations in support of peacekeeping operations if they desire. As a result, funding for peacekeeping operations looks roughly similar to the general contributions to the United Nations system. Normally, peacekeeping operations are authorized by the Security Council in response to threats to international peace and security. A resolution outlining the scope of the operation is passed, and troop donations from UN member states in support of the operations are called for. For most operations, the Council meets to reauthorize the operation every couple of years, as outlined in the original mandate. The veto power of the P5 means that each of them may prevent the UN from deploying peacekeeping operations. But there's a special situation regarding the use of peacekeeping forces that deserves mention here. In June 1950, North Korean forces launched a series of attacks across the 38th parallel into South Korea. Korea had been split in half since the end of the Second World War, with North Korea aligned with the Soviet Union and South Korea aligned with the United States, a situation similar to that of East and West Germany. The North Korean military quickly overran South Korean defenses, occupying about 90% of the country within a few weeks. 2 days after the outbreak of hostilities, the United States requested the Security Council take up the question and prepared a draft resolution authorizing the use of force against North Korea in defense of the South. The Soviet Union, which had been boycotting participation in the Security Council in protest of the fact that China's permanent seat had been occupied by the Republic of China or Taiwan and not by the People's Republic of China, a situation that would not change until after the normalization of relations between the US and China under the Nixon administration in the early 1970s. The USSR believed that the veto provision of the Charter meant that any vote required affirmative consent, that is, a yes vote, on the part of all P5 members. However, the Council concluded that it merely meant that none of the P5 voted no. Abstentions or not voting would not constitute a veto. As a result, the Security Council voted to authorize the use of force against North Korea while the Soviet Union was absent. When the Soviet Union returned, they used their veto power to block all action on Korea, effectively hamstringing UN operations there. In order to circumvent the veto, the Uniting for Peace resolution was passed in 1950. Uniting for Peace permits the General Assembly to enter a special emergency session to address threats to international peace and security when the Security Council is deadlocked due to a veto by one or more of the P5. When it does so, the General Assembly effectively operates on behalf of the Security Council, meaning it can authorize the use of force or take other enforcement measures. Because the decision to refer the matter to the General Assembly is a procedural rather than a substantive question, the P5 veto does not apply. And because the vote on the resolution in question then occurs in the General Assembly, the P5 do not have their normal veto power. Specifically, Resolution 337 of 1950, which established Uniting for Peace, states that if the Security Council, because of the lack of unanimity among the permanent members, fails to exercise its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security in a case where there appears to be a threat to peace, breach of the peace, or act of aggression, the General Assembly shall consider the matter immediately with a view to taking appropriate recommendations to members for collective security measures, including the case of a breach of peace or the act of aggression, the use of armed force when necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. The Uniting for Peace provision, in other words, effectively permits the Security Council to override the veto of a permanent member of the Council by referring the matter to the General Assembly where no veto provision exists. The Uniting for Peace action has been used a total of 12 times since it was created in 1950. After the Korean War, the next use was in 1956 to address the Suez Canal crisis. That crisis was one of the more interesting of the Cold War crises, sparked when Britain and France, in conjunction with Israel, launched an attack against Egypt in an effort to seize the Suez Canal and prevent its nationalization by Egypt. The United States, which had strongly warned Britain against such an attack, was outraged because the invasion undermined U.S. efforts to court Nasser government in Egypt into an anti-communist alliance with the United States. The United States and the Soviet Union each responded with resolutions to address the crisis, both of which were vetoed by Britain and France. And so the matter was referred to the General Assembly under the Uniting for Peace policy. The General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the immediate ceasefire, demanding the withdrawal of forces, and imposing an arms embargo on all combatants. It also authorized the deployment of UN peacekeepers to monitor the ceasefire. Other uses of Uniting for Peace include the situation in Hungary in 1956, several sessions dealing with the situation in the Middle East in 1958, 1967, and again in 1982, the situation in the Congo in 1960, the situation in Bangladesh in 71, the situation in Afghanistan in 1980, Palestine in 1980 and 1997, and Namibia in 1981. Why is Uniting for Peace so rarely evoked? In part, there's an informal agreement between the P5 that over-reliance on the Uniting for Peace procedure weakens the power in the Security Council. As a result, they're hesitant to use it and are willing to place great pressure on other states not to pursue it. Still, it represents an important contribution to UN peacekeeping operations. Despite their increasing use, peacekeeping operations have come under criticism from several fronts. The first, and perhaps most obvious criticism of UN peacekeeping operations centers on the political nature of their use. Because UN peacekeeping forces can normally only be deployed by a vote of the Security Council and depend on the willingness of member states to provide troops and funding to support the operation, they're not always deployed when most needed. Historically, the most well-known example was disagreements between Security Council permanent members paralyzing the United Nations in Rwanda, permitting a genocide to take place as the world watched. Similar hesitation on the part of some P5 members to authorize operations have slowed the process of deployment in Congo, Somalia, Darfur, and Syria. Second, it's often questioned whether UN peacekeeping operations are effective in achieving their goals. On first blush, their utility appears limited, and the dramatic failures of UN operations in 1994 Rwandan genocide or in the 1995 Somali crisis reveal real limits. At the same time, their operations have been successful in other places. A 2005 report by the RAND Corporation concluded that the United Nations was successful in peacekeeping and nation-building efforts in 7 out of 8 cases reviewed. The RAND Corporation contrasted this with American-led unilateral efforts, which by their review were only successful in 4 out of 8 cases. Even when they're approved, UN forces can be slow to deploy. In part, this is because of the time it takes to gather, train, and deploy peacekeeping soldiers. To counter that delay, the UN has proposed the development of a standing rapid reaction force that would be able to be quickly deployed as needed. To date, that proposal has languished in committee. Perhaps most troubling UN peacekeepers have also been accused of sexual abuse, rape, and solicitation of prostitution while deployed in Congo, Haiti, Liberia, Sudan, and elsewhere. In response to these allegations, the UN has taken several steps to make reporting easier and to punish soldiers who engage in such crimes. The UN has also sought to increase the proportion of women serving as peacekeepers. While historically representing a very small portion of overall peacekeeping forces, today approximately 30% of all peacekeepers worldwide are women. Let's end our consideration of UN peacekeeping operations with a brief discussion of the Responsibility to Protect, or R2P. In 2005, the member states of the United Nations unanimously adopted the World Summit Outcome Document, which outlined the Responsibility to Protect doctrine. R2P commits the United Nations and its member states to take steps necessary to prevent genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. This decision was largely seen as a response of the failure of the international community to prevent the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. Specifically, paragraph 138 of the World Summit Outcome Document states that each individual state has the responsibility to protect its populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity through appropriate and necessary means. Paragraph 139 commits the international community through the United Nations to the same. Specifically, it states the international community through the United Nations also has the responsibility to use appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means in accordance with Chapters 6 and 7 of the Charter to help protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. In this context, we are prepared to take collective action in timely and decisive manner through the Security Council should peaceful means be inadequate and national authorities manifestly fail to protect their populations. The responsibility to protect rests on three pillars. First, states agree that they have a responsibility to ensure the protection of their populations against mass atrocities. In theory, most states should be able to meet this obligation. In situations where states are unwilling or unable to protect their populations, the second pillar becomes important. Here, the international community agrees either to help build capacity of individual states to protect their own populations and/or to take action to protect populations where the state is either too weak or too unwilling to do so. Finally, the third pillar commits both states and the United Nations to undertaking timely and decisive action to prevent mass atrocities from taking place. While R2P is a relatively new doctrine in international law, it's already been mentioned in several Security Council resolutions, including resolutions addressing the situation in Darfur in 2006, the Côte d'Ivoire in 2011, Yemen in 2011, Mali in 2012, and Sudan and South Sudan in 2012 and 2013. The responsibility to protect has also provoked some important debates. The R2P clearly represents an innovation in thinking about the nature of states and the limits of state sovereignty in the international system. Specifically, it represents an important step away from the idea of absolute sovereignty under the Westphalian state system to a system of conditional sovereignty predicated on the fulfillment of certain domestic and international obligations. The deployment of the R2P doctrine has also been uneven. While it was regularly cited in Security Council resolutions in the early 2010s, the use of R2P to support operations in Libya soured some members of the international community on its use since then. According to critics of Western intervention in Libya, the responsibility to protect doctrine was used in Libya not to protect civilians, but to facilitate regime change. India's UN ambassador, Hardeep Singh Puri, argued that the Libyan case has already given R2P a bad name, and that the only aspect of the resolution of interest to the international community was the use of all necessary means to bomb the hell out of Libya. As a result, China and Russia have both steadfastly opposed the use of the R2P doctrine in Syria, where they fear similar goals may be deployed. Thus, R2P has, at least in some situations, fallen prey to the great power politics that defined the UN peacekeeping operations during the Cold War. That concludes our consideration of peacekeeping in the UN system. I hope you found it useful. Please check out the other videos in dealing with the UN system. Thanks, everyone. Bye.